All right. Well, thanks for coming. Let's just go ahead and pray, and we'll start our Sunday school lesson. So, Lord, we come before you now, God, as your people. Lord, I pray that you would speak now, that we would learn from you. Lord, that you would be glorified, that we would know more about who you are and what you want from us. And Lord, we thank you that we don't have to guess what you want from us. You've spoken to us clearly through your word. And so, Lord, because of that, that's why we come. That's why we've come here today to hear you speak through your book today. And so, again, we thank you for this place and this time that we could do that. In the name of Jesus, amen. I know. I mean, you all know what I do for a living, so I might. I just might. I just might have cooties. All right. There we go. How many of you guys enjoy camping? Show of hands. Okay. But do you really? Do you really? How many of you pretend to enjoy camping? Yeah, Dawn, all right. How many of you dislike camping and you're not afraid to admit it? Am I really the only one? Oh, Randy, my man.
Yeah, I like holiday and camp.
It was a really freeing day for me when I realized, you know what? I really don't like this. And I'm not embarrassed by it, so I'm going to own it. But even if you like to camp, how many of you have had just one of those terrible trips where everything went wrong? I mean that's a universal. Something breaks on the camper. The weather doesn't cooperate. Yeah, something breaks on your tent. The weather's terrible. Something else breaks on your camper. You forget to put ice in the cooler. Something else breaks on the camper. There's noisy neighbors, right? For some reason, they think you like to listen to their music. And so you forget the propane. Something else breaks on the camper. We've all had experiences like that. And it's hard. What's that? I don't have one. Because it kept breaking. But it's hard to maintain a good attitude, right? Well, we're going to spend the next 5 weeks looking at what I think is literally the worst camping trip ever. And I'm talking about the time that the children of Israel spent wandering in the wilderness after their exodus out of Egypt that Seth covered in the previous month. So this is a map. This you might find a few of these online, but this is one of the more accepted maps as far as the route that the children of Israel took when they left Egypt and they wandered in the wilderness, which really is this area called the Sinai Peninsula, is this area of the wilderness. You've got Egypt, you've got the Promised Land, and then you've got this big area in between. So they crossed the Red Sea. We'll come back to this map again. But now listen, if I camp, this is a typical place I like to go. This is Meadow Lake. This is about 60 miles southeast of Salmon. This picture does it no justice. It is so beautiful up there. We all live in Idaho. We've seen places like this. It's breathtaking. It's so beautiful. But here's a picture of the typical landscape in the Sinai Peninsula where the Israelites camped. Compare, right? So this is where they camped. This is a view from space of the Sinai Peninsula. Not exactly the most lush, inviting environment, but this is where they camped. I mean, you think their camping trip was bad. They camped in the desert. There was no water. There was no food. They were attacked by a group of people called the Amalekites. There were poisonous biting snakes. There was this raucous idol worship going on within the camp. Fire from heaven, ground opening and swallowing people up. There was leprosy, there was desertion, there was sedition, complaining, and one of their own prophets tried to curse them. And this didn't just last for a long weekend. This was for 40 years. In this place, in this desert land. Why? And for what purpose? And what can we learn from their experience? Now, I don't want to be irreverent when I say that this was the worst camping trip ever, because through it, God was preparing a people. God was preparing a people who would be his representatives to the world. And the New Testament says that these things happened as examples for us, so that we would know more about who God is and what his plan is for the world. This verse in 1 Corinthians, Paul says these things. If you read the whole chapter, chapter 10, he's referring to the things that happened during the wilderness wandering. These things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. So these stories are in the Bible for a number of purposes, one of which is for us, for our instruction. So fortunately, it happened to them. It didn't happen to us. So we can just look back and read about it and say, man, that must have been terrible. And then we can say, I'm glad that if I was in the camp, I sure wouldn't have acted the way they did. But these things were written down for our instruction. Now, the camping trip that we call this wilderness wandering was difficult, mostly as a direct result of their unbelief. And it didn't have to be as hard as it was. But the people were continually distrusting in God's care and continually distrusting in God's sovereignty. And to an extent, it's understandable. I mean, for a minute, just pretend you're a Hebrew 3,500 years ago. And you were born and you were raised under slavery in Egypt. There's no places to worship your God. There's no prophets or religious instruction. There's this verbal transmission of the stories we all know well from the book of Genesis, and those are handed down, stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And a bunch of horrible things are happening around you. Seth covered all that stuff. The 10 plagues, most of which didn't directly affect you, but they were happening in the land. And you're hearing rumors about this guy named Moses who's interacting with the king of Egypt, and he's trying to negotiate the release of the Hebrews, but to where and for what purpose? And you find yourself in this huge crowd of people after the first Passover, which you don't really fully understand the full significance of the Passover, but you're in this crowd with hundreds of thousands of people. And you don't know where you're going. You're just following this group and you go through and you walk on dry ground through the Red Sea, and now you're on the other side. The Egyptian army has drowned, and you're in a desert place. Furthermore, your leader, Moses, only recently learned your God's name. He didn't even know who God really was. He just got out of seminary himself. And he, in Exodus 3, when God speaks to Moses out of the burning bush, and God has to introduce himself to Moses. And God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And Moses says, yeah, but what's your name? He had to ask God what his name is. What's your name, God? I don't even know your name. Your people don't even know your name. What is your name? And so God had to introduce himself to Moses. And God said, my name is Yahweh. I am. And I'm going to show you what that means. So now what? We just learned God's name. A bunch of chaotic miracles have occurred. We're standing in this desert. Well, in God's kindness, because this is all so new, he continues to provide ample evidence to his people of who he is, the great I am. Seth took you on a jet tour of what it was like for the Hebrews in Egypt and all the circumstances surrounding the Exodus, but I'm going to take you on a jet tour through 40 years a wilderness wandering for this people group called on by Yahweh himself to be his representatives to a lost and dying world. So how's it going to pan out? Now, I cringe when I hear people talk about the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament. Have you ever heard this before? That and of course we know it's the same God, but Christians even will be kind of confused about the character of God. Seems to be in the New Testament loving and kind, and in the Old Testament he's judgmental and harsh. But I would suggest to you that if that's your view of God, then you haven't really read the Bible honestly. Because, for example, what did God tell Adam would happen on the day that he ate of the forbidden fruit? He would surely die. What did not happen on the day that Adam ate from the fruit? He did not die physically. He lived another hundreds of years. He deserved to die. God said he would die, but he didn't die. He didn't get what he deserved. That's called grace. Then we read time and time again about the failures of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob's sons. And in Exodus and Numbers that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks, we read about the failures of Israel. Yet they're still given this land that was promised to them. They didn't deserve it, but they got it anyways. What's that called? Grace, right? And how long did it take after they inherited the land for them to be carried away into Assyria and Babylon? I mean, hundreds of years of bad kings and idol worship. Why did God allow them to stay as long as he did? Grace. And then he allowed them back into the land. They didn't do much to deserve that either. Grace. The whole Old Testament story is the same as the New Testament story, and it's a story of God's grace on God's people. And we see that time and time again as he provides for these people. So before I run out of time, let's read out of Exodus. So if you're not there already, go ahead and get to chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. As I said, they just came through the Red Sea. The first part of chapter 15 is a song of celebration and victory because they've just passed through the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army has just been drowned in the Red Sea. And they get to the other side and they're relieved and they sing this song, and it's a wonderful, beautiful song about God's provision and his sovereignty and his strength. In verse 13, it says that you have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. In God's love, he has led the people that he has redeemed through the Red Sea. And then verse 21, Miriam, who's Moses' sister, she picks up a tambourine and grabs a bunch of ladies, and they start to sing as well. Sing to Yahweh, the Lord. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. It must have been a wonderful celebration, right? But after verse 21 in Exodus 15 comes verse 22. And that's where we're going to pick it up. And for some reason, I'm in Psalm. I was actually reading Psalm 90, which was written by Moses. And he refers back to some of these incidents. Sorry, New Bible. Okay, Exodus 15, start in verse 22. This is the New King James, by the way. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now, when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he, Moses, cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. There he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them, and said, this is God speaking, "If you do diligently heed the voice of Yahweh, the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. So they encamped by the waters. So the first stop on this worst camping trip ever is this large area called the wilderness of Shur. And there's no water. Surprise. It's a desert. So they travel for 3 days, and they come to this area, this place called Marah. And there is water, but what's wrong with the water in Marah? It's bitter. So bitter that it was undrinkable. So you go from no water to, oh, yay, there's water. And then you taste it, and you're like, this is not good water. This is so bad, we can't even drink it. So what did they do? Did they cry out to Yahweh, their deliverer, that they just sang praises to about his strong hand and his deliverance and his provision? Did they cry out to him? No. What do? They complained. They grumbled, some of the versions might say. And that seems somewhat understandable, right? I mean, it's a desert, it's hot, you're thirsty. What would you do? But this is their default response to crisis. When we read through Exodus and we read through the accounts in Numbers, this is their default response, is to grumble. And God, by the way, most of us have children. What's our response when our children complain? Complain back, right? We complain that they're complaining. We grumble about their grumbling. But God responds very graciously here. He instructs Moses to cleanse the water by throwing some kind of log into it. He gives them some miracle to cleanse the water to make them not bitter. Now remember, this is pre-covenant. There's a very significant event that happens in Exodus called the giving of the law, the covenant. That happens around Exodus 20, I think. That hasn't happened yet. Remember, Moses just learned God's name, and they're just learning about the character of God and what he is capable of. And they've seen it with their own eyes, and they've experienced it firsthand. And they haven't received this covenant law yet. God has revealed himself personally to Moses, but not to the children of Israel yet. And so pre-covenant God is a lot more gracious. He gives the covenant and tells them what he expects of them. And then after that, God still is gracious, but he starts to get a little more hands-on with regards to more affliction and punishment, because they continue to disobey. They continue to distrust. But this time it's all grace. It's all grace this time. It's too bad the God of the Old Testament is so harsh, right? He gives them water. They need water. They complain about it. He gives them water. A big point of this story and a big point of today, and I don't know if this will continue over the next few weeks, but is this idea of grumbling and complaining really has no place in the lives of God's people. And Paul affirms this in the New Testament. This is 1 Corinthians 10 again. These are the verses before the verse I just told you before. He said, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did. He's talking about these people, the nation of Israel who came out of Egypt. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. That's a specific account that happens in Numbers, and I think we'll probably get to that. But he said, we must not put Christ to the test, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. There's something quite significant about this idea of grumbling and complaining. This is not a harmless, innocuous sin. This is something that is significant. Paul tells us in Philippians to do a few things without grumbling. No, he says to do all things without grumbling or disputing. Do all things. He's talking about the life of the church here. And then in James, he says, do not grumble against one another. When's the last time you grumbled against or about someone in the church? Don't grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. So this idea of complaining and grumbling really has no place in the life of a believer, especially in the life of the church. In 1 Peter, he says, show hospitality to one another without grumbling, right? Be hospitable. But if you do it and you complain about it, that's not real hospitality. So this idea of grumbling and complaining, I mean, we all do this, right? I mean, none of us is immune to the sin of complaining. Just some of us some are better maybe at hiding it than others. This morning, we were coming to church, and I went to the coffee pot to fill up my cup, and it was empty. Now, I had just gotten done putting this lesson together, and I complained. Like, seriously, what was coffee?
That's the exception, right?
I don't know. Philippians 2 is pretty clear about doing all things. Fortunately for us, there's grace, right? There's always grace, and that's exactly what God gave to the Hebrews, was grace in the form of fresh, clean drinking water. And the lesson he wanted to teach them was, listen to me, trust me, obey me, and I'm going to take care of you. And he brings them a little bit further south to Elim. And in this place, there was not just one, but there were 12 springs of water. This is grace upon grace upon grace. 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Just a beautiful, green, lush oasis for them. And verse 27 says that they encamped there. I bet they did. Said, let's stay here. Well, for whatever reason, they had to move on. And one thing I want to point out, though, about verse 26, if you look at verse 26, God makes a promise to Israel that if they listen and obey him, that he would keep them from experiencing the plagues that he put on Egypt. So this idea of obeying God and not experiencing a plague. And God identifies himself in this verse as the Lord, our healer. This is a beautiful name of God, isn't it? The Lord, our healer. Jehovah Rapha, the Lord, our healer. This is a beautiful title and name of God. However, this is not a universal promise to all believers at all time, because many believers throughout history have died by dehydration. They've gone to bed hungry and sick. We know that sickness, disease, and plagues are not always the result of disobedience. Sometimes it is, and it would be for Israel during this time of their wilderness wandering, but it's a mistake, I think, to immediately assume that if someone is sick, that it is God punishing them for some kind of disobedience. That's what Job's friends did. They thought Job had some secret kind of sin and that he was being punished for that. But that's not always the case. This verse 26 is not intended for us to take to the bank and say, well, as long as I obey God, I'm not going to get sick. It's a lesson to be careful about taking some specific promises to specific people at specific times and not make a universal application. We have to be careful of that, especially as we go through Old Testament. Now, there are some applications because the point is that God is specifically providing for his people in the wilderness, and he is specifically establishing himself as Israel's national God. And if we want to talk about the effects of disobedience and sickness and healing, et cetera, in the life of a Christian, we can talk about that some other time. Not today, though. I just wanted to point that out because sometimes we might see a verse and be confused and be like, well, I'm sick or I'm struggling or I'm suffering, and perhaps this is the hand of God on me, and he told Israel that he would punish them with plagues if they didn't trust and obey him, and therefore that's what's happening to me. Now that might be the case, but it's not a universal cause for us to seek God's blessing on our lives through obedience, because he gives grace oftentimes whether we obey him or not, right? He did this to the Hebrews, and he does this to us all the time. And again, it's too bad the God of the Old Testament is so harsh and judgmental. No, he's a God of grace for all time. But we have to move on because I want to get to chapter 16. Chapter 16, we're not going to read the whole chapter. We're going to just read the first portion of it, see what happens next. What happens next, right? God provides some water miraculously. What happens in chapter 16? More trouble, more grumbling, but then more grace. So chapter 16, verse 1. So they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaining against the Lord. But what are we that you complain against us?" Also Moses said, "This shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. And what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses spoke to Aaron, "Say to all the congregation of the children of Israel, Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your complaints." Now it came to pass, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God." So it was that quails came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So chapter 15, no water, then bitter water. Now chapter 16, no food. Like I said, worst camping trip ever. Where's the food? They go into the desert of Sin. That doesn't sound good. It's coincidence, by the way. It's just it's not our English word sin. It's just something about the etymology of this word. Because remember, they're in the area called Sinai, Sinai. So it's just coincidence, but it still just doesn't sound very good. They're in the desert of Sin. But they grumble again. We don't even know why yet. It says in verse 2, the whole congregation gathered together and grumbled. And then verse 3 says that they were unhappy with the food situation, that they had it better back in Egypt. Now notice it doesn't say they didn't have any food in the desert. It just says that they were hungry. They didn't have maybe as much food as they would have liked, or maybe it just didn't satisfy their longings. If you look back in Exodus chapter 12, when they were given instructions about leaving Egypt, they were told to take livestock and herds and bread. And so they have food. They were probably exaggerating a little bit when they said they were going to be killed by hunger, which is usually what we do when things aren't going our way, right? If you were able to look at the things that you complain about, like my coffee situation this morning, if I were to stand back and objectively look at that, I might have exaggerated just a little about the significance of what happened. That happens when we're faced with difficulty. We have a hard time separating ourselves from the difficulty, and we tend to exaggerate and make things seem worse than they really are. Or am I the only one who does this? Okay, good. Speaking of this whole grumbling situation, notice in verse 2, it says that they grumbled against Moses and Aaron. But in verses 7 and 8, we're told that their complaining was actually against God himself. They're complaining about Moses, but their complaint was actually a complaint about God. And that's usually the way it is. And so think about it. The next time I want to complain that there's no coffee, for whatever reason, my complaint is not directed. There's a possibility that my complaint could be directed not just to the individuals who may have consumed the coffee, but there's a possibility that my complaint could be directed at God himself. Okay, I'm not going to complain about coffee anymore, right, when I think about it that way. But the thing about our complaints is that God hears them. How many times, as we read through, I was struck by this. I didn't think about this before, but I was struck by this as we read through this. How many times God said, I have heard. I have heard. I have heard. I hear you, he says. I hear your complaining. For better or worse, right? This could be taken in a positive in that I hear your complaints. I know what you're going through. And that's wonderful news. That God hears our complaints. But remember, the Israelites are complaining not in a positive way. They're complaining in a very negative way. Their complaints are against God. In fact, later on, Moses says that they are testing God, that they are testing God's goodness, that they are calling God's goodness and his kindness into question. So this is not a positive complaint. And so there's a difference between complaining if you're going through something difficult and you cry out to God, because this is what Moses does several times. He cries out to God, and God hears that. And the sort of complaining in a negative way, all those New Testament ways that I mentioned those verses on, God hears that too, right? And when we complain about our circumstances, we are basically saying, God, you don't know what you're doing. You are not taking care of me well enough. You are not providing what I need. You, God, are to blame. And that's really what complaining in this circumstance is. You're blaming God. And that's why complaining and grumbling is not a little thing. This is a big deal, as I showed you. It's repeated again and again. But God is testing Israel to know if they're going to trust and obey him. And why wouldn't they? Right? Already time and time again, he's provided for them. Now, he's going to provide them an evening meal of quail. He's going to bring meat for them to have dinner that night. And then the next morning, manna, bread from heaven, will appear, and it's going to feed them for 40 years. And this is important because what did Jesus refer to himself as in John chapter 6 after he fed the 5,000 men besides women and children? What did he call himself? The bread of life, the bread from heaven, the true bread from heaven. The crowd in John chapter 6, they also complained. In John chapter 6, Jesus fed them lunch. And instead of celebrating that, they said, "What else are you going to do, Jesus? Moses fed us for 40 years. You just brought us lunch. What else do you got for us?" And so they complained, and Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall never hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst." So he's just not talking about lunch. He's just not talking about 40 years of manna in the wilderness. He's talking about everlasting life as the true bread from heaven. But surprise, there are many in the camp who still do not trust the Lord, because later on in the chapter, they're given specific instruction. Well, we read about it, that on Friday, on the 6th day, you're to get a double portion of the manna, so that on the next day, on Saturday, on the Sabbath, you don't have to do any work. They could rest. And some greedy people went out on Saturday morning to see if there was manna to try to collect so that they could have even more, because they still didn't trust God to take care of them. And they went out there and there was no manna. And God said to Moses, "Why? How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" Notice, God hasn't given his law yet. But he asks, "How long are you going to refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" What commandments and laws? What is he talking about? There's no 10 commandments yet. There's no dietary laws yet. There are no social laws on the books yet. What commandments and laws is he talking about? Well, he could be talking about future, what laws will be coming. But the only commandments so far are trust me, and on Saturday, get some rest. Why is trusting and resting so hard? Because I struggle with it. Many of us struggle with it. The children of Israel struggled with it. But that's all God is requiring of them right now. Trust me, and on Saturday, put your feet up and get some rest. Don't worry about collecting food. I'll provide enough for you on Friday. And so this idea of trust and rest is really the only commandment God has given them so far. But for some reason, it's really hard. Chapter 17 doesn't get much better. We have time, so let's look at verses 1 through 7 of Exodus 17. Exodus 17, then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin. Whew, let's get out of that place. According to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people said, "Lord, you gave us water the last time we didn't have any water. Can you provide us water again?" No. The people contended with Moses, and they said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So it really seems these events happen back to back to back. No water, bitter water, not enough food. And again, now they're in Rephidim. There's no water again. And like I joked, it's not like they didn't say, "Hey, Moses, the last time we had this problem, God wonderfully provided for us. Do you think he could do that for us again?" No, they didn't say that. And then they didn't even just complain. It says that they contended or they quarreled. They argued. They fought with Moses. This suggests a much more heated exchange. And it was so bad that Moses feared for his life. He thought the people were going to stone him. And his first reaction is to pray. Don't you love that? It's no wonder Moses is such a hero of the faith. I mean, the people's first reaction is to complain. Moses' first reaction is to pray. Not always, but, most of the time. And so we can look to Moses, and Moses prays, and in verse 4, he cries to the Lord. And God has him do something interesting. He has him strike the rock with the staff, and then water comes out. There's nothing magical about this staff, but this is the same staff that turned into a snake in Moses' presence when God was trying to prove to him who he was, and then it turned into a snake in Pharaoh's presence, and then this is the same rod that he used to strike the Red Sea so that the waters of the Red Sea would part. And so this rod is the symbol of God's power and his provision. And in the next chapter, take some time today or this week to read the rest of chapter 17, because what happens after this is now they have to go to war. You thought your camping trip was bad. Now there's a war. And they have to go and fight. These aren't necessarily trained soldiers. They just got out of slavery in Egypt. And now they have to go and fight this war. And in this battle, Moses is standing up way up high on the mountain, and he has the rod and the staff in his hand, and he has to hold it up. And even with having nothing in your hands, holding your hands up for an extended period of time is difficult. And as long as Moses' hands are up, they're winning. But as soon as his hands start to drop and they get tired, they start to lose. And so he gets a couple of guys to come and help him hold his arms up. And as long as his arms are up and that staff is up, showing the power and the provision of God, and the Israelites are able to look up there, and they're able to see their leader, and they're able to see the staff that brought them through the Red Sea and just provided water for them. It gives them courage and strength. And they can look up on the hilltop and they can see Moses interceding for them, and it can acknowledge that they have to depend upon God for victory in battle too, and not on their own strength and not on their own zeal. And so even though these stories involve a very specific people group, I think we can apply these two aspects to our own lives as we go throughout our day and our week. And they go hand in hand. Because when we grumble, apparently we're not trusting God. We're complaining to God that he doesn't have our best interests in mind. And so grumbling and trusting God is this theme that we're going to see as we work our way through this camping trip. And next week, we're going to talk about, I think, what we'll do is we'll talk about the incident when they finally have the law. Moses comes down from the mountain, and what does he see? They're worshiping a golden calf, not Yahweh, not the God of Israel who brought them through the Red Sea. So we'll take a look at that next. Let's go ahead and pray. So Lord, thank you for this time. Lord, thank you for your instruction. That's what law means, your instruction. And we can apply so many of these principles to us today. Lord, thank you for bringing Israel through the Red Sea. Thank you for providing for them. And Lord, that we can look back on their circumstances, and we can look back on our own lives, and we can see how you've provided for us in so many ways. And you are a God of grace, and you give us more than what we need, even when we complain, Lord. And so we just ask, God, that you would help us to not be complainers, help us to trust you more, and Lord, give you the glory for who you are. Amen.